Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast, the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. As ever, I'm your host, Robbie Love. Now, English is the most widely spoken language in the world if we include second language speakers. But there isn't really any such thing as one single English language. Really, it's highly diversified, and there are many identifiable varieties of English. And this week, we're going to be discussing the role of corpus linguistics in the study of world Englishes, the many different varieties of English spoken around the world. There's some really interesting histories and stories around how these varieties have developed. My guest is Dr Guyanne Wilson, Quirk Lecturer in English Linguistics at University College London, and a colleague of a previous CorpusCast guest, Baz Art, who we had almost 2 years ago now, discussing the history of the survey of English usage. So do go back and check out that episode if you're interested to hear more about the history of the corpus linguistics research at UCL, University College London. But today we're speaking with Guyanne, and Guyanne researches the sociolinguistics of world Englishes, particularly the attitudes and ideologies surrounding their use. And she also explores how new norms develop in world Englishes and how they change over time. Guyanne has conducted ethnographic, interview, and survey-based research in Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, Jamaica, Nigeria, and Ghana. And today we'll be discussing her work contributing to the compilation and annotation of both the Trinidad and Tobago and Ugandan components of ICE, the International Corpus of English. Guyanne is a member of the International Association of World Englishes, the International Society for the Linguistics of English, and the Society for Caribbean Linguistics, and currently serves on the editorial board of the journal English Worldwide. So without any further ado, to help us unpack the contribution of corpus linguistics to the study of world Englishes, please welcome my guest on today's episode of CorpusCast, Dr. Guyanne Wilson. Hello, Guyanne. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Robbie. Thank you for having me.
It's great to speak with you after meeting you for the first time earlier this year at a conference in the summer. And I'm really grateful that you agreed to come on the show and tell us more about your research. So thank you very much.
Thank you for asking.
I'd like to start by asking you the question I always ask my guests to begin our conversation, which is, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Corpus linguistics, I don't want to say what it means to me, I'll just say what it is to me instead. For me, it's a really important methodology for exploring language. It's a way for us to look at large amounts of language data, or relatively large amounts of language, to better understand how language is used in real time and how language is used by actual speakers rather than the things we think of in our heads. Yeah.
And this is something I'm always curious about when I speak with guests on CorpusCast, because it's not something that has very much visibility necessarily growing up. And yet here we are doing this sort of thing for a living. So tell us about your journey towards becoming, as you are now, a Quirk Lecturer in English Linguistics and involved in corpus linguistics. Tell us about your academic journey and how you came to have this career.
So I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, and I went to school there until I was 18. And at that time, we still did British A-levels. So during my A-levels, I did Chaucer and Margaret Atwood, and I got really interested in, well, how did language change like this? And so that's when I decided I would be a linguist, although I didn't know the word then. So I just said I'd be an Englishologist.
Englishologist?
Yeah. Because all my friends are saying, I'm going to be a biologist. I was like, fine, I'm going to be an Englishologist. Like, it's a thing. And now I feel qualified to say it's a thing. Yeah, and I won a national scholarship from the Trinidad and Tobago government, which allowed me to go to King's College London, where I studied English language and linguistics as my undergraduate degree. And then I got a Cambridge Commonwealth scholarship to do my master's at the University of Cambridge in linguistics. I took a break for a while. I didn't have a regular academic career. I worked as a teacher and a freelance writer for 3 years. Because in Trinidad, if you get a national scholarship, you must return.
Oh,
to
okay.
pay back the government, which is fair enough because like taxpayers have paid for your education, so it's a fair trade. Um, and yeah, and then one day when I was working in Trinidad, I got approached by someone via Facebook, so don't ever knock social media, say there was a professor in Germany who was about to set up a chair, and she was building the International Corpus of English, Trinidad and Tobago, and she had PhD positions, and would I be interested? And it was Tuesday. Because maybe if it was Wednesday, I'd have said no, but it was Tuesday, and I said, yeah, sure, I'd be interested. And so I packed my things, moved to Germany, did a PhD, and I should say as an undergraduate, my one encounter with corpus linguistics as an undergraduate, I thought, oh, this is not for me. And then I moved to Germany and start compiling a corpus and getting really excited about it. Um, and then after my PhD, I went back to Trinidad for a small while. Then I went back to Germany to do the German postdoctoral um, thesis. Um, and at that point, I was hired at another institution and contributed towards building the International Corpus of English, now the Ugandan component. So that's sort of how I started from being in Trinidad to being in the wider world,
Yes.
and being a corpus linguist. Yeah.
What you said that you were sort of not so keen at first when you studied corpus linguistics. What put you off, and how was your mind changed?
I think what put me off was that I was 19 and then just not over. I think I had just very clear ideas about what I thought I should be learning, um, or what I thought I was interested in at that time. And I think it was an introductory, it was part of a larger course. So it was 6 hours of learning about corpus linguistics. And at that point, I didn't see how it would link to my other interests. I didn't understand that I could use it to do sociolinguistic work. I didn't understand. Um, I did corpus linguistics, that little six hour thing, and then the next year I did world Englishes, and I didn't know about the International Corpus of English. And so I think, and this is not a criticism of like my undergraduate degree in any way, because I really enjoyed that, but I think I just didn't know. And it's just one of those things that you get older and realize, oh, this was something I didn't really appreciate at that time.
Well, that makes sense. I think that's a common experience, and something I try and think about quite a lot when I'm teaching corpus linguistics is the way that I introduce this to somebody who's learning about it for the first time is potentially really influential on
Yeah.
their uptake and how interested they become. And it's something that I try and sort of wrestle with every year when I'm teaching my cohort of students. I still don't think I've quite got it. I think there are so many different possible routes into corpus linguistics. I'm
Definitely.
not sure if I've yet found the most effective one or the most engaging one, but it's interesting that you through doing the PhD project, it's similar to my story in one sense, in that similarly I was given my PhD project. It wasn't my idea; it was a project that had been developed, and then I was hired, so to speak, as the person to do that project. And so it wasn't a topic that I was passionate about beforehand, but by being made to do it,
It's
where I became, by necessity, I became quite interested and passionate in it, which is, quite an interesting way to go. But I want to ask you as well about your current role. You've been at UCL for a couple of years now, I think,
Yeah.
and your title is interesting because it's quite rare in our field, at least, to have, I guess you call it a named or endowed position. Quirk Lecturer, of course, named after Randolph Quirk, the founder of the Survey of English Usage, and very influential researcher in the field over many decades, of course.
Yeah.
But this is quite unusual in our field. There aren't many corpus linguists or linguists who have this kind of named position where
Yeah.
you're reminded of a predecessor in the field every time you introduce yourself, right? So I kind of just want to ask about how that came about, and how that kind of how well that kind of aligns with the sort of research you do, and whether you've had, I suppose, any people expecting you to be doing certain things because of the association with Quirk.
How it came about was honestly that Randolph Quirk left an endowment to UCL. And I think, to the colleges, the department's credit, before the job was advertised, they didn't ask for somebody who necessarily did exactly what Randolph Quirk did. They wanted somebody who had done corpus linguistics. They also wanted someone who had done world Englishes. And so in that way, the job description, how the college interpreted the bequest was that basically that how they interpreted it allowed for me to have quite a lot of freedom, or allows me to have quite a lot of freedom in my research. I think because, especially in world Englishes, Randolph Quirk was, or remains, I don't want to say controversial, but he is a figure that is viewed quite critically within world Englishes. But I also think he's an important figure in that regard because if you are in world Englishes, everybody knows about the Quirk versus Lecturer debate. But that happens really at the founding moments of this discipline, of the discipline of world Englishes. And so it allows world Englishes to sort of reflect on, well, what do we do? And what is this discipline about? And how do we make sense of that? Because many of the arguments that Quirk raised within that series of articles where he and Lecturer are debating remain relevant today. Like, lots of people think only English in the UK counts as standard English. Lots of people think, lots of foreign language learners don't want to learn like Indian English, or they still want to learn British English. And so those ideologies still remain. And so I think that's really important. And I don't think, there are sometimes expectations that people think I'm going to be quite prescriptive in how I use language. But if you think of what Quirk did in terms of building the first spoken the first corpus of spoken English in English language, the point of something like that is not to be prescriptive. It is to be quite descriptive. And so I think in that regard, what I focus on, because I am really interested in spoken language, and I am interested in how do we create corpora for spoken language. And so I think in that regard, our research interests definitely can align. And when I've had people say very unkind things to me. I remember once somebody said, well, they use the Quirk et al. 1985 as a doorstop. And I just think that's completely not necessary, because it remains an important linguistic document. It tells us how English was spoken in the late 70s to 1980s. It remains something that was based on corpus research that uses real life examples that showed us how this could be done. And because world Englishes is still at that phase of trying that type of description, I think it's a really, it can be difficult because there is a weight of expectation that I'm going to be really clever, or that I'm really wealthy. I'm not. I'm paid just the same as other academics at my level. But it's fine.
I think I wasn't expecting that. That's I think you that must be quite difficult, and I think you deal with that very, very, very well in the sense of perhaps a weight of expectation around your research. But I think what you're saying absolutely makes sense, and good on UCL for facilitating this position to be interpreted in the way that it allows you to come in and take things in in an important direction with world Englishes. And this is obviously the topic of today's episode. So I want to dive in a little bit now and ask you about, first of all, your own. You mentioned earlier your journey and working in different linguistic contexts. What is it about world Englishes as a broadly defined kind of area that makes you tick? What is it that sort of gets you out of bed every morning to work on either building or analyzing data that you gathered from different varieties of English? Where do you see the value and the importance of this sort of research?
I remember when I was an undergraduate, when I got into sociolinguistics, Jenny Jenkins said in the very first lecture I ever had in sociolinguistics that sociolinguistics is about justice. And I was like, right, that's what I want to do. And I think in that regard, World English is about justice because it's about describing varieties of English and letting people understand that these are not broken varieties of English. These are not mistakes that people are making. These are systematic varieties that have developed over time and that have developed norms um, and I mean, just the fact that you could contribute to that and helping, um, like when you think of, and this still hasn't happened, but this is my dream for World English is in terms of a concrete contribution we can make is so that more people can have learning materials or when students do exams in English or other subjects, they aren't penalized for using their varieties or when they do spoken exams, like really understanding how do these varieties work, what is standard in these varieties, and sort of giving respect to languages or varieties and their speakers. So that's really what makes me passionate about World English is. And yeah, and the corpora help in that regard because we can see the systematic things. Because when you have lots of data, you can see, oh, this isn't a mistake. This is something that lots of people are doing in a really regular way.
Yeah, and that ties in nicely to your work on the international corpus of English, or I suppose I should say international corpora of English, because there are many of them now. You mentioned earlier you've worked on a couple of these, one for Trinidad and Tobago and one for Uganda. What is the for those who are not familiar, what is the sort of overall kind of aim of the ICE set of corpora or the ICE project? What's sort of the big picture here with these different teams of researchers who, for I think a couple of decades now, have been kind of adding bit by bit varieties of English into this kind of collection of corpora?
So I would say the main aim of the ICE Corpus project is to build a large corpus of different varieties of English, so comprising different subcorpora that contain both spoken and written varieties of English that can be compared because they contain the same types of texts. So you have in each ICE corpus 300 spoken texts and 200 written texts. It might be the other way around, but I think that's doing it around. Collected in different text categories. So conversations, phone calls, legal debates, classroom interactions, business interactions, but also different types of written text. And this allows us to study language across varieties of English. So you can look at the regional variation in that regard. And in so doing, we can have a better understanding of what standard English really is. The first ICE corpus, as I'm sure you know, was created at the Survey of English Usage, and that's ICE-GB. And and now I think there are over 27 varieties that have been recorded now or that are in the process of being, for which corpora being made. And so I think it's a really useful resource in that way because it allows linguists to look at language across varieties and look for generalizations, then things that are really true for all varieties.
So there's this sampling frame that is, I guess, like a recipe book or an instruction manual for corpus compilers who want to take that design and then go off and gather data for a new variety of English that hasn't already got a corpus in ICE. What you mentioned working on the Trinidad and Tobago and the Ugandan version. Are they both completed now and finished? And what specifically is I'm assuming you weren't working entirely alone, and maybe there are teams of researchers working on both of these. So tell me a bit more about your role on both of these, and I suppose the challenges of applying a model that's already there, specifying the text types, going to a new context and trying to fit the data you can get into that model.
Okay, so I'm going to divide that into 3 questions.
Yeah, there was a lot there. I do apologize. I've only had 1 coffee so far. We're recording in the morning, and so I asked you a lot there. So you you go ahead.
Okay, so the first question is, what was it like? Like, how do you compile such a corpus? So ICE Trinidad and Tobago, when I joined the team, when I started working with Dagmar Doiber, who was the person who was responsible for ICE Trinidad and Tobago at the University of Munster, she had already been to Trinidad for a year and had got some of the conversation data. But we worked as a team. Basically, she had people collecting data in Trinidad. I also contributed to data collection, along with Michael Westphal at Keele University now. We also like recorded conversations, and it's a huge team effort, basically. And then the other one part of that team effort, for example, is getting copyright. Like, copyright is a mess. That's why it takes sometimes so long for corpora to be released, because you need copyright permissions, especially for things like documentaries or written data. You have to have copyright permission to add it to the corpus. So you have teams. So for ICE Trinidad and Tobago, I worked a lot on that. The corpora really closely transcribed for the spoken parts. So for ICE Trinidad and Tobago, we had a first transcriber and then a second transcriber. And in that regard, I was very often the second transcriber, just because the transcribers for ICE Trinidad and Tobago were very often from Germany. And so I was really like cleaning a lot of things. So yeah, that was that experience. Then I was a younger researcher. I didn't have a PhD then. When I joined ICE Uganda, that was as a more experienced researcher. And so that was really exciting, because there again, the teamwork was really important. But the funding that Christiana Mayakord, who was the lead for ICE Uganda, had, it allowed her to collaborate with Gulu University in Uganda. And so we had a Ugandan team. And that was really exciting for me, because I got to train them basically in how do you do interviews, like how do we get the data that we want. I was really involved there with training people in how do we transcribe, how do we get the transcripts done correctly. And then again, I was involved in checking what became the final product. So I think for both of them, I did a lot of text checking, but for ICE Uganda, I played a bigger role, I think, in the final product. And for ICE Uganda, I also designed a manual, which we based on the manual for ICE Sri Lanka. So I don't want to take too much credit for that, because we didn't just use the ICE Sri Lanka manual and just like fix parts of it. But I think it was really important, the whole notion of collaboration and getting the different texts, in making sure the texts are, because, for example, for the written part in ICE Uganda, what you would find is that you would think that something, because it's from two different newspapers, it's two different texts. But then when you read, it was actually that it was produced by a government agency and every newspaper printed it. So you have to take it out. And yeah, so there were lots of things like that. I think the biggest challenge, so that was the first thing. The second question you asked about was collecting in different contexts. And I think context there has two challenges. One is of time and one is of cultural framework. So when ICE was conceptualized, and ICE has always been conceptualized as a corpus of spoken language, but of standard English. And that presents a challenge for both Nigeria and Trinidad and Tobago. So for Trinidad and Tobago, for example, so basically the criteria that have been used to decide what standard English would be things like, these are the settings in which standard English occur. But in the Trinidadian context or the Caribbean context, code mixing, or what somebody called Valerie Youssef has called varilingual competence, so the ability. So maybe I should go back a step and say that in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a Creole spoken alongside standard English. And so a competent speaker in Trinidad is not just somebody who can use both, but who knows how to mix both effectively. And so it's really difficult sometimes, even in your most formal context, such as legal cross-examinations, which you think are going to be very highly focused standard, for someone just to use standard English. And so that becomes a problem, for example. And actually people are using Creole and standard English very skillfully. So Michael Westphal and I did a paper on that called Creole and Power, where we, in courtroom settings, where we looked at how those are used differently. So that's one contextual thing. The other contextual thing has to do with time, when ICE GB was first organized, or was first conceptualized, people wrote letters.
Okay.
Like, and so there's a whole section, like familiar, like personal letters. Nobody writes letters anymore.
Yeah.
And so there's been in the ICE community a whole debate, well, do emails count as letters? But guess what, guys? Nobody writes emails anymore either. So it's actually been a huge challenge, at least in the Trinidadian context. And then in Uganda, you have the problem that, well, if people are speaking to other Ugandans, they're probably not going to speak English. And so the conversations there sometimes are, I think it was your paper at our conference we met at that showed that sometimes conversations look a lot like interviews. And I can't remember the details of the paper, but I just remember looking at that presentation thinking, yes, this is the problem with ICE Uganda, because actually the way to negotiate that was to have these sort of semi-interview type conversations, which are not really conversations. And when you have things, for example, like news, which is also one category, like news reports in ICE Uganda, this also happens in ICE Philippines. You would have the newscaster say, and so today in Makerere, this is what happened. And then you would interview somebody and they would be speaking Luganda. And that would be erased from the corpus. So you end up erasing quite a lot of important things about how English is used in a community. And I think that was one of the big challenges of adapting ICE to contemporary or the actual international sections that it's the international varieties that it's meant to capture, because of the rules of how ICE is made, you end up taking out Creole speech. So if you look at ICE Jamaica, lots of the Creole speech has just been is signed off as something else, or when it's multilingual settings, it's just not transcribed. And it's, on one hand, it's fine because we want a corpus of standard English. But the thing about corpora, the thing that it can show us is, well, how is English existing, or how is standard English existing with other varieties? And so that, I think, is the biggest challenge of the truly international part of ICE.
And that sounds like it's introducing kind of a layer of artificiality in the sense that if you're removing bits because they're inconvenient to this model that's being imposed in a kind of monolingual frame, which may well have been appropriate for the GB version 20 or 30 years ago. But even in the British context, it's no longer, or maybe it never ever was in the first place, accurate to kind of that it's only ever, a certain text or certain conversation will only ever be in English. And so it's interesting that in trying to make these comparable data sets, we have these issues of comparability of the authenticity of the actual situation. I think that's an interesting sort of challenge for people to think about sort of moving forward, because there's certainly, in recent years been much more of a focus on multilingualism in corpus linguistics and applied linguistics, and kind of trying to kind of move away from this Anglocentric view. But this still feels a bit like an imposition.
I think it's really difficult, because I think what ICE offers in terms of allowing us to have the ability to compare lots of varieties of English, I think that's really a very powerful thing. And I think that shouldn't ever be undervalued. I think that is really powerful. But at the same time, I think it's just important that researchers are aware of that, and so that they can be honest when they're looking at their research, or just because sometimes if you don't read the manual, you don't read every part of the manual. But if the manual writers haven't put that, if it's not recorded anywhere, people might not be aware of these finities. And corpora can offer us so much, but it ends up with questions, really, I think, at the core of corpus linguistics and sociolinguistics, and where they meet of what is representativeness, what is authenticity, and what counts as authentic language. And so it's not a criticism in that way of ICE being wrong, but it's really a challenge of seeing, well, when you work with ICE or any corpus, these are some of the things to consider. Oh, and the other thing that's really random, which I think is interesting now for ICE is that there's no online genres in ICE because ICE GB, which was the first corpus, and ICE India, which they were the first to, I mean, they predate like email or widespread email use and things like that. So they're no online, and so I think there's a lot of room for different types of genres and different types of corpora beyond ICE.
Yeah. It sounds like a new additional model or parallel model might be needed. Yeah. Obviously, you've been involved in building some of the ICE corpora, but predominantly you're doing your own research on variation and the use of English in various contexts. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you've learned, say from the ICE one of the ICE corpora, like the Trinidad and Tobago one. You've published research using that data set, looking, for example, at the sort of differences between British and American variants of words is one example. But I wonder if you can say a little bit about the kind of things you've discovered or learned about some of these varieties in your own research.
So the thing that's not published, because it was my postdoctoral thesis, but where I engaged with all the corpora really, or some of the corpora really intensively, was I looked at grammatical variation in different varieties of English, and particularly agreement with collective nouns and existential constructions, which doesn't sound exciting, but it really is. It's really very exciting. Because, for example, in British English, there's a tendency towards, even though singular agreement is more popular still, or more commonly used still, there is a tendency towards saying like the government are, or the team are, like the team are useless, or the government are very good. Like, I don't want to say anything against the government because I'm an immigrant. Whereas in American English, at least in writing, there's a tendency towards singular. And so I was interested, with existential constructions in both varieties, there's a tendency towards there's plus plural, so there's 5 people type constructions, and both of those things have been claimed as vernacular universals. And I sort of asked myself, well, if it's universal, it should be happening in all varieties of English. And what I found is that it's not happening in Caribbean Englishes or African Englishes, it just doesn't happen. And that's really interesting because both Caribbean Englishes and African Englishes, one of the sort of features that people use of these Englishes when they think of them as non-standard varieties, so not necessarily standard versions, is that there's that subject verb agreement is unmarked. So you can say he buy 3 grams of sugar, and he buys 3 grams of sugar, as you would see in standard British English. And so you would sort of expect, based on these models, or based on what we know of both West African pidgins like Nigerian pidgin and Ghanaian pidgin, and Caribbean Creoles like Jamaican Creole and Trinidadian Creole, you would expect really that because they have 0 marking, that things like the government are and the committee are would happen quite a lot. Yeah, because there's already a provision for that in the variety. But it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't ever happen. And that's really interesting, because what you're seeing is that the outer circle variety, to use Lecturer's term, seems to be more conservative than the inner circle variety. And trying to find out why that happens has also been quite exciting. And I think it happens because of how ICE has been compiled, you only have really standard speakers. And it's really marked. So people are going to avoid, because when I checked in the corpus for occurrence, or the corpora for occurrences of 0 marking with B, I'm going to check with other verbs because I realized B is problematic. But I found that, well, people were agreeing there as well. And so it seems to be that in really formal context, non-agreement doesn't really happen. And then view people, because I'm a big believer in, you can't just use the corpus. You have to check with the speakers. Because I'm like, lots of people say, well, once there's evidence, that's proof of acceptability. And I'm like, when you've compiled the corpora yourself, you realize, well, no, maybe let's ask people. And then when you ask people, realized, yeah, no, people would say things like, well, no, in school we're taught this. Or they would say things, well, in British English they say this. And then you would be, nah, I'll let you think that for a while, because it's really this sort of conservative thing. And I think that's been the most exciting thing that I found in recent times.
So that's really interesting. The point you just made there, you're sort of almost going back to check with speakers of the variety that what you're finding in the corpus data is sort of on the ground level actually kind of meaningful and makes sense. This is, from my perspective, it's not something you very often see. Are you talking about going back to the same people who contributed data, or just any speakers of the variety?
Yeah, sadly, I can't go back to the same people, because that's not ever possible in my work. Yeah, but I have, so for that particular work, what I did is I compared the 6 varieties, and then I did acceptability studies for the same features. And what I found then in the acceptability studies was that the features weren't occurring very much, and people also didn't like them.
Oh, okay.
And it's like, so the government R doesn't occur, but people also think the government R is not acceptable.
Okay.
And then when you debrief the interview, the respondents, they say, oh yeah, no, but that's awful, that's bad English, that's awful, you can't see that.
That's really helpful, I suppose, in triangulating what you're observing,
Yeah.
or even just understanding better what you're observing.
Yeah, and I think especially with smaller corpora like ICE, things like that are really important, because with a high frequency word like government, it's fine, like nothing. You can get lots of hits. But there was one word that was really interesting, and that was police. Because even with police, which is not a real collective, but it's a really interesting word to look at, you would find a lot of speakers using police is, even though, and so that then became, well, why do you say police is? Like, well, yeah, if you say the police, that's one police. That's one police. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize. Like, and so talking to people, you begin to realize, oh, well, this is why this could account for this. And with a small corpus where you can only have a limited number of hits of words like police, it's not, or even lower frequency words.
About 1 million words, right?
Yeah, each ICE corpus is 1 million words.
Wow, it's a really it's a refreshing to hear this approach, because it's something that you sometimes see people writing about is a good thing to do, but in terms of actually having another layer of I guess validation of what you're seeing in the data, and I think that's a really good practice to kind of share. I think there'd be an awful lot of interesting studies to go back to papers that have reported what they found in the corpus, and then go and do this other layer of sort of seeing whether that actually makes sense with speakers in those communities. I want to ask about what you're currently working on as well. You mentioned before we started recording that you're currently building a new corpus of Caribbean English. Is that part of the ICE framework, or is this something separate?
It's not part of the ICE framework, but I have sort of borrowed a framework from something that's begun to be called HICE, so the Historical Corpus of English. The first one of that in that set was HICE Ghana, which was built by Thorsten Bratto in Regensburg, and now there's HICE Nigeria, which was done by Fuluke Onobua in Redeemers University, Nigeria. And so yeah, I'm doing that for the Caribbean. But where HICE Caribbean, where HICE Trinidad and Tobago and HICE Barbados will be different from the currently existing HICE corpora is that I am going to include a spoken component. Because the challenge of World English is that they're not that old. But they develop quite quickly. And so HICE Trinidad and Tobago will have a spoken component going back to 1945. Because there is quite a lot, at least when I've done my work on lexical things, where I looked at lexical norms, there seems to be generational change with lexical norms and how people orient to different lexical items. And I think once in a class, I played a recording of the first Prime Minister of Nigeria and the current Prime Minister of Nigeria. And then I did it for Jamaica.
Mm.
And the students were like, oh, wow, they sound completely different. And that's in a 60-year framework. And so I think there's something to find there. And so I'm really excited about building those corpora. Yeah.
So it's you mentioned three different varieties there. That it sounds like quite
Yeah.
a big project. Are you
Yeah.
working alone, or do you have a team? And how how do you sort of make those initial connections with people when you're trying to find sources, historical sources, I suppose, even harder than trying to get contemporary data.
So now I feel like a grown-up academic because now I go to archives,
Yes.
which I think is a very grown-up academic thing to do. Um, and so I'm starting with Trinidad and Tobago because that's where I'm from, and so that's where I can start making initial connections. And there's also a written part in the Heist corpus, and the other corpora are written, but they're mostly based on newspapers. And I also want to have non-newspaper things. And so I have been looking at the archives at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine. And that's where I found something really interesting,
Uh-huh.
which was I was looking just for people's letters and looking and see, like, this is what they have. And I came across the writings of a man who's been dead for a few decades at least. And he wasn't university educated, but he was like a writer, and he wrote for the Port of Spain Gazette, and he also like edited a working man's newspaper. And so he had they had his writings and things like that. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I'd really like to get access to this particular archive. And then I looked at the guy's name, and it was like the Arthur Raymond Archives. I was like, oh, that name sounds really familiar. So I sent my dad a WhatsApp. I was like, what's your grandfather's name? And he's like, Arthur Raymond. I'm like, oh, do you think this is your grandfather? And he's like, yeah. And then he's like, oh, contact this cousin of his. And she's like, yeah, I wrote about him. I wrote about him because she's a writer. I wrote about him in this collection of short stories. And then another aunt sent it to me. And so they're quite interesting connections like that, where you could just go to the university library, like, can I have my great-grandfather's papers? Which I think are quite nice. But then they're just also sometimes just more challenging connections that you have to make, where you have to, I mean, it might not show, but I'm actually quite shy. But where you have to jump over the first hurdle and be like, hi, this is what I'd like to do. This is why I'd like to do it. Can I have access to this data? And I think that, yeah, I would like it to be a team. You need money for that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, right now I'm at the stage of, please give me money so I can like make my dreams come true. But I'm also at a really, I think, nice point in my career where I don't feel the need to finish this in 2 years. Like, where I understand that this will take time and this will take effort. And because for me, this is something I really, when I first started in corpus linguistics, it was a means to an end. And now it's something I really care about, and it's a discipline I care about. And this is a corpus whereas before I worked with other people on a corpus, on their corpus, like, this is my idea and this is something I want to do. And even with the spoken data, I found recordings, because I decided, like, a genre that's really popular in the Caribbean is the talent show. And so I decided I'd look for talent show hosts, because that would also be a really good idea of how standard language is being used over time, yeah? Because talent show, yeah. And then I'm going to have data from my great aunt as well. And so it becomes sort of, yeah, this is my career, but this is sort of the things people in my family did unwittingly that have set me up for my career. Yeah, and so in that way, it's okay for me if it takes 5 years or 10 years to build a really good corpus that people can use and that's valuable and that really is a good, because now I've worked on the corpora, I understand what it takes. I think I understand what it takes to make a good corpus, and I'm not willing to rush this and just make it fast so that somebody can have it for the ref. Like, it's not about that to me.
I think that's really really, I'm so happy to hear you say this, because I think that there can be a sense of pressure, sometimes external, but in my case, often internal, a sort of self-imposed pressure to try and churn out the next paper or the next project as quickly as possible, just because we're on this never-ending treadmill, right? And I think that what you're saying is really valuable, as a reminder to not necessarily feel such a pressure to do it right, and to take the time, especially in this case where you've got these personal connections. You've literally got ancestors and members of your family whose stories you're preserving as part of your data collection, which must be it must bring a sense of pride that you're able to do that, right?
I think, yeah, because my family is not poor, or I don't want to claim an identity that's not true in that way. But like, my parents didn't go to university, and my mother died when I was 14, but just after she had submitted her bachelor's thesis. So she started university when I was in year 7, and then she submitted her thesis and died. So university killed her. Um, but and for me, that way, it's just been a way I could connect. That's why I studied English. Like, it's not even a big surprise. Like, oh, your mother said, okay.
Mm.
But also, I think for my dad and for my family, and my family's always been a huge support for my career. They've never been like, what are you doing, woman? Like, go and get married. Or they've never, ever done that. And so I think, yeah, and for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, who've paid, like, I went to the the church primary school and then a regular grammar secondary school, but always state funded education. The state paid for my bachelor's degree. The Commonwealth paid for my. So I feel like if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it well. Like, if I'm going to make this, if I'm going to document this variety from before our independence to now, I want to do it really, really well. As sort of, if this is the only thing I could give back to the people who have given me so many opportunities. I mean, like, because if I think of it, I'm somebody from Trinity. Like, when I started primary school, there wasn't even a school in my town.
Mm.
And now I'm just like at one of the best universities on the planet, like being allowed to do this work and being allowed to do work that I think is worthwhile. I think people are owed that. And I think one of my colleagues said was, the problem with the current situation in academia is that we will never have time to do something like what Randolph Quirk did, because writing his big tour, that took time.
Right.
And I think, well, actually, yeah, there are smaller projects that I'm involved with that will
Right.
give the output that people need. The outputs will be there. But if I'm doing something like this, I want to do it well, because I don't think it's just about me.
I couldn't think of a better way to sort of bring our conversation to a close. As much as I wish I didn't have to, because this has been so interesting, and I think you've made a lot of really, really important and good points here, particularly about the pressure to publish, and the impacts indirectly perhaps that may have on the scope of the kind of work that we can do. Because you're right, we hear stories about how in the earlier days of corpus linguistics, you'd have a team of researchers who would spend 10 years, or longer, sometimes even longer, than building, a 1 million word corpus or something. And that is hailed as a great achievement and something really valuable. And nobody would ever look back and go, oh, well, they weren't being productive enough.
Exactly.
They weren't contributing enough to their unit of assessment or whatever, and so I think that's really important, because I certainly feel that sense of having lots of ideas and feeling a little bit restricted in terms of, okay, well, what can, that's going to take too long, or there isn't funding to do that, or I can't do it on my own. And so I think that's really good, really important. Thank you so much, Guyanne. It's been.
Thank you for having me.
We covered all sorts of ground here, and I think it's been really, really interesting, and I'm sure our listeners will agree. I want to finish by asking just one quick question, which I ask all our guests, and it's I used to ask more, but I feel a bit bad about sort of grilling, I guess, after already. So I just settled on one, and I think it speaks to a lot of our viewers and listeners who are students of corpus linguistics, postgraduate students, PhD students. What would be your number one piece of advice for students who are embarking on corpus research, the beginning of their corpus linguistics career?
Read the corpus. Obviously, if it's a whole huge corpus like Globe, you can't read the whole corpus, but read the corpus, get to know the context. Like, don't when you get your keyword in context, don't just look at it and choose. Like, open the examples, read the corpus, get to know the data, and understand. We're not doing maths, we're doing language.
Yeah.
And so don't just tell us about frequencies, understand the language that's happening there. Yeah.
Very wise words indeed. Thank you so much, Guyanne, once again. It's been so wonderful to get the chance to speak with you. I'm very grateful for you coming on the show. That is indeed all we have time for today's episode of CorpusCast. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In this case, we have the video here and everything. Thank you, Guyanne, as well. Thank you to our listeners and viewers as well on YouTube, Spotify, no longer Google Podcasts. Apple Podcasts still going. Google Podcasts went under a little while ago. But yes, do let us know your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced, as always, by my esteemed colleague, Sam Cook. So thank you once again for listening to CorpusCast. Thank you, Guyanne Wilson, for being an excellent guest, and we'll see you soon on the next episode of CorpusCast. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.